Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Kids in Mind, the seminar series from the University of Sydney to give practical, honest, reliable information for families during this pandemic. My name's Professor Adam Guastella, and I'm a clinical psychologist and Michael Crouch Chair in Child and Youth Mental Health. This seminar series is meant to engage and to provide opportunity for questions and to give you practical advice. We have a chat function in this Zoom, so if you'd like to use the chat throughout the seminar, we will see the questions. And don't worry, other people will not see the questions, just the panelists. So you don't have to be worried about the questions that you ask, but we're going to endeavour to answer as many questions and not shy away from the difficult ones. The point of this seminar series is also to get experts with knowledge in areas that can be confusing and difficult for families to manage. And so we've gotten the best experts. On Monday last week, we spoke to Phil Britton about COVID in kids, and Phil gave us some great information about COVID. Knowledge that about 1 to 3% of kids will experience a severe reaction to COVID and require significant care, possible hospitalisation, that most kids will in fact be okay. And some of the moderators of that is age. So younger kids seem to do better than older kids. This seminar follows on from that and raises the question about vaccine safety, vaccine efficacy. And today we've got Associate Professor Nicholas Wood, a paediatrician and expert in vaccines. Now, I sit on a panel with Nick and we review trial protocols all the time. He is detailed, he is knowledgeable, he is one of the best in the business. And I'm thrilled to be able to invite him on today to talk to you, to give you his perspective. We're not here to convince you to take a vaccine or to convince you to give vaccines to your children. That is not our role at all. Our role is to give you evidence, to give you the information so that you can make a decision that's best for you and your family. So we're going to start by playing the video that's pre-recorded. It'll go for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have Nicholas here to answer questions and to continue a much longer, further discussion. If we don't get to any questions or you think that there's other things you'd like to ask, please write to us in kidsinmind@sydney.edu.au and we'll seek to reply. And if there are topics you'd like us to address in the future, also suggest and we'll try and find an expert. All right, thank you very much. All right, welcome Associate Professor Nicholas Wood. Thanks for joining us today. We've got a really important discussion today, one that's going to be of major significance to the nation shortly as the vaccine rollout heads to young, older children, aged between 12 and 18. Nick, I've invited along because he's one of the best experts in the university on clinical trials and safety and reviewing clinical trials and safety, and has an enormous amount of knowledge. Welcome, Nick.
Thanks, Adam. Hi there.
Hey, maybe to start, could you just give us a bit of a background on your knowledge about clinical trials and your expertise?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a paediatrician and based at the University of Sydney, and also work at the National Centre for Immunisation Research and Surveillance.
Great, thank you. And so I imagine you've been involved in the reviews of efficacy of vaccines over the last year or so?
Yeah, so we've been looking very closely at NCRS, which is the National Centre. Our group provides support to the government in their decision making about which vaccines to roll out and the policy around those. So we've been looking very closely at the AstraZeneca and the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine as well.
Great. Well, look, this particular talk is going to focus on youth, but just for a headline summary statement, what's the overall evidence of efficacy in regard to vaccines for adults?
So efficacy relates to how well the vaccines work in the trials. And we know from the trials that both AstraZeneca and Pfizer were more than 90% effective against hospitalisation and dying. And now when it's gone into the real world, so when these vaccines have been rolled out from hundreds of millions of doses across the world, we also know that they're very, very effective in stopping people from getting hospitalised or from dying from COVID.
Okay. And I assume in all of the trials you're talking about, they're largely placebo-controlled trials, is that right?
Yeah. So the original trials have been placebo-controlled, or the UK group actually used an active comparator vaccine, which was the meningococcal vaccine. So, so they're able to really look at the safety and the effectiveness, because one group got the active product and the other group didn't.
Okay, all right. Now, just to step through the youth data, my understanding is the first report of a youth vaccine came out in January of this year, but it's formally published, I think, a couple of months ago in New England Journal of Medicine.
Yeah.
And it was about the Pfizer vaccine. Could you step us through the evidence and safety profile of the Pfizer vaccine for 12 to 18-year-olds?
Yeah, so in this trial, they looked at 12 to 15s, and then they compared that to the 16 to 25-year-old age groups. And as part of a trial, they sort of do three main things, really. They look at your antibody response. So they take a blood test before the vaccine, see how much antibody you make after the vaccine, so they can see your rise in antibody against the virus. They also look at the safety. So people on these trials are asked to fill out diary cards and collect a lot of information. And then the bit they also do is the efficacy. So they look at how many kids ended up getting SARS-CoV or the COVID virus. And in terms of efficacy, the Pfizer vaccine was extraordinarily efficacious. In fact, it was 100% efficacious. So there were no cases in the Pfizer group, and there were about 16 to 20 in the placebo group. So that was a good demonstration of how efficacious the vaccine was. And then also they looked at the antibody levels, and the 12 to 15-year-old antibody levels were really good. In fact, they were 1.5 times higher than the 16 to 25-year-olds. And that really just shows that the young immune system is able to recognize this vaccine and make a good amount of antibody. And then the third part they looked at was the safety. And again, they looked at safety in 12 to 15s and 16 to 25-year-olds. And there was no real difference really in the safety profile between the younger kids and the older teenagers. So that's just a summary.
So, I mean, I remember the reports in January coming out. Everyone was really excited, reporting the 100% efficacy rate in relation to contracting COVID. And since then, there's been some reports, I've heard some reports of side effects that parents are concerned about in relation to the vaccine. Can you tell me a little bit about, beyond this particular trial? Actually, we didn't talk about numbers. I mean, we're talking about a couple of thousand participants in this particular trial that received either the placebo or the Pfizer. But we know there's now much larger real world trials. We're talking tens of thousands of children and youth, I should say. Can you step us through some of that data?
Yeah, so what happens when the vaccine gets through the sort of trial process, and then when the company feels they've got enough safety data and immune data, they then take that to the regulators. And so in Australia, the regulator is the TGA. Equivalent in the US is the FDA, and then there's a similar one in Europe called the EMA. And these regulators look in detail at almost every participant and their safety and immune responses. And if they feel comfortable, then they'll authorise or register the vaccine. And so once the vaccine starts to roll out into the community, we don't stop watching. And so we keep looking for safety concerns or safety signals. And so Australia has a system similar to the US where if you get a vaccine and you feel a bit unusual or off or get sick afterwards and you go and visit the doctor, that doctor is required or supposed to report it to the surveillance system. So it's a passive reporting system. And in the US, they've now been doing this for a few months and looking at, as you mentioned, tens of thousands of teenagers and showing.
Let me interrupt there. It's actually 9 million. I just 9 million teenagers. Yeah.
Yeah. And they've looked at both Pfizer and Moderna. And in this system, there's a passive system, but there's also another system called VSafe, which is an active text-based system where you actively follow up kids and their parents after the vaccine. And they've looked at the things, that the side effects in the first week, and they've shown that, yes, you can get some headache and some muscle aches and some fever, and these are quite common and similar to what you would see and we've been seeing in the adults. But they've also found a very small risk of an issue where you can get inflammation of the lining of the heart or of the heart muscle. And so that's been included now as a sort of information to give to parents. Now, if you do get this particular thing, it usually happens in after the second dose, and it usually happens within the first week. And in all the adolescents that have had this particular issue, they've all been able to be treated very successfully with things like Nurofen or Panadol, just to treat the pain. And it's an inflammation sort of response, so the inflammation just slowly subsides and goes away. So that's, I suppose, what's important for the group to hear is that just because the vaccine's gone through the trials, it's now being rolled out into the community, we've still got eyes on it. We're still watching and looking for any particular safety concern.
Now, there's been a bit of publicity about the heart side effects from Pfizer. Can you talk us through those side effects?
Yeah, so I mentioned that it's an inflammation of the heart, and it does happen more with the mRNA vaccine, so the Pfizer or the Moderna, and it's more common in young males and probably more common after dose 2 and more common to happen in the first week. So if people do have the vaccine and then they get a bit of chest pain or a bit of palpitations, then they should go and see the GP or the emergency doctor, who can do a range of tests to try and understand whether it really is this condition or whether it's some sort of other story like a muscular ache or a joint ache or even anxiety related, which we know that can happen. Some of the symptoms from anxiety can sort of mimic physical symptoms. So the doctor can assess you, do a range of tests, and just try and work out exactly what is the underlying cause for this.
And in these side effects, is there any evidence of long-term significant side effects on youth?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, they've now been following the kids in the US for a few months now. So, and there's no evidence of any long-term concerns about neurology or development or growth. Nothing has come to light. They'll continue to watch. So it's true to say we haven't got data on kids 1 or 2 years after the vaccines because we haven't been using them for that long. But it's a bit of a trade-off between getting the vaccines into people to stop them dying and getting hospitalised, with not having data out to 2 years after a vaccine, if that makes sense. So if we were to say, take the attitude of let's wait until we've got safety data on 2 years worth before we rolled out the program, that would mean that many lives would be lost because we wouldn't be rolling out the vaccine to so many people.
So, I mean, should parents be concerned given we don't have the 2-year data?
I don't think so. No, I think, we certainly know that these vaccines are very effective. They will, more than 90% in stopping you dying and being hospitalised in the adults. And so one key way to protect the kids, particularly the under 12s, is for the adults to get vaccinated. So, and we know that they work really well, and we also know that they're at the moment working well in the Delta periods. So the adults getting vaccinated is good for the adult themselves, but also good to protect the younger kids. We also know that although the cases of Delta in climbing, particularly in Sydney, most of the transmission is happening in the household. And so if the adult brings it into the household, but the adult, then that will transmit. So other people in the house will catch it. So one way to stop the adult bringing it into the household is for that adult to get vaccinated. Now, for the under 12s, we're not yet, nowhere in the world has registered or licensed a vaccine for the under 12s. There are some vaccine trials underway, and these are expected possibly late September, early October. And again, they'll have to be looked at by the regulators.
And again, I'm trying to evaluate the benefit of giving youth the vaccine. What are the considerations that go through your mind?
Yeah, so I think we sort of bundle it into sort of 3 areas. There's the direct benefits to the kid themselves. So although we know COVID in the main in younger kids is not too serious, there are the occasional case where they do get quite sick. So vaccinating the kid themselves will prevent them from getting COVID and nasty COVID. There is this sort of rare inflammatory syndrome called multi-system inflammatory syndrome that can happen after COVID. And so getting the kid themselves vaccinated will stop that. The other thing is that it makes sense that if the kid gets vaccinated, has less virus when they get exposed, that they're also then less likely to transmit. So it does have some help in stopping transmission in the community, but probably not as much help as vaccinating adults. And then the third benefit really is the wider benefit, so that at a community level, if we can get the kids vaccinated, but mainly getting the adults vaccinated, then we can allow kids to get back to sort of normal life, back into the school classroom. And we know that that has enormous benefit for their physical and mental well-being. So there's a whole range of things.
Okay. Nick, one of the things that I keep hearing a lot is a concern around the speed at which the vaccines have been developed, and whether that's a cause for concern.
Yeah, so I think the way to answer that, Adam, is to say that there weren't any corners cut. So the large adult trials of 30,000 people there's a lot of money, a lot of people involved in the development, much more than you would expect with a normal vaccine development. And that's mainly because of the pandemic and the urgency. So getting a lot of money, getting a lot of people meant that they were able to enroll the 30,000 people in a very quick way. Didn't take months to enroll 30,000 people on a trial. They were able to do it in weeks because they had 100 sites across the US. People were keen to take part. So, just a demonstration of that if you get, a lot of willpower, a lot of people involved, that you can enroll quickly. But people were still on the trial for the whole trial period, the whole 6 months, 12 months follow-up. It's just that they got them on in a more efficient and faster way.
Right. Okay. So what you're saying there is that actually the same processes were followed, the same amount of sort of regulation was involved, but it just, because of the resources, it was done much faster.
Yeah, that's right. So it didn't take, you didn't start enrolling in January and finishing enrolling in June, and then follow the last patient out for another year. They were able to enroll in a couple of weeks. So that the whole process just happened in a more faster, efficient way. But the individual people were still following the protocol and were still followed up.
The other question I've had from families is the difference between a sponsored and independent trial. Can you talk to the issues around whether it matters whether a trial is sponsored and if that lowers the quality of the trial?
Yeah, so the sponsored trials are all, the main thing is they're industry funded. So the pharmaceutical fund company or their investors pays for it. But it still has to have a protocol. It still has to go through the ethics committee, still has to be approved by an independent ethics committee. And now all of these trials have to have on them what we call a data safety monitoring board, which is a group of experts, again, not part of the company, independent to the pharma company, who will look at the safety data and look at the immunogenicity data. So there's this sort of checks, if you like. It's not like the pharma company can just go off and present only the positive data. But when it also goes to the regulator, like the TGA or the FDA, they've got a complete dossier. So they can see all of the results and all of the safety results and all of the antibody results, etc. So there's lots of checks and balances along the way.
Okay, that sounds great. All right. Now, one other email that came through was around the upcoming Moderna vaccine and your opinion in relation to that and the Pfizer vaccine for youth.
Yeah, so Moderna has been rolled out in the over 12-year-olds in the US, in North America, and it's registered at the moment in Australia for 18 years and older. It's the same sort of vaccine as the Pfizer, so it's an mRNA vaccine. The safety is very similar to the Pfizer vaccine, and at the moment, the TGA, our regulator, is looking at their data from Moderna to decide whether or not to lower the age limit down to 12. And that's expected soon. So what we'll hopefully end up with in maybe a few weeks or so is having 2 vaccines, either Pfizer or Moderna, for that 12 to 18-year-old age group.
And should parents be thinking about which to choose?
No, I think either is efficacious, either will work, and either is safe. So they both, as I said, similar sort of side effects. ATAGI is looking at that, our government immunisation advisory group, and so they'll probably make some recommendation as well. I think it's probably fair to say ATAGI did say that the first kids in that 12 to 15-year-old age group that should be getting the vaccines are the kids that have the chronic medical problems, and also the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids, because they're the ones that are just a little bit more likely to end up being sicker if they get COVID, and therefore they're the ones that we should be sort of prioritising for the vaccine.
Okay. Now, finally, before we go to the chat, I'd like to ask about resources. I think families are finding it really hard to get good resources on vaccines and information about vaccines. Where do you recommend families go to get reliable and honest information?
Yeah, so there's obviously the Commonwealth website, the immunisation.health.gov.au. That is a little bit hard to navigate, I will admit. I'm not a designer of it, but it is a bit tricky. But there are 2 other places that are quite useful in Australia. One is the National Centre for Immunisation Research and Surveillance. So that's ncirs.edu.au, and there's lots of fact sheets there. There's lots of frequently asked questions. And the other one that's very good is the Melbourne Vaccine Education Centre, so mvec.edu.au, I think. And they've got also lots of easy to understand information as well.
Great. Well, we'll put those links in the chat. Thanks very much, Nick. Let's go to the chat.
Thanks, Adam.
Thanks. Bye. We're here. Great. So thanks, Nick. Thanks for the pre-record. Since we did that, we've got a lot of questions, so we'll go through them. But since we did that pre-record, actually, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation in the UK came out and provided mixed advice about the use of vaccines. They said they partially supported it in youth and didn't support the idea in children. And then almost on the same day, the CDC released data from their COVIDnet hospitalisation surveillance network, suggesting that vaccinated peers were 10 times less likely to go to hospital than their youth, that age 12 to 17, than their unvaccinated peers. It makes it incredibly hard to navigate, to understand the data. Can you just give us some background to the JCVI decision and how you weigh up risk versus benefit given these mixed messages that people are getting?
You're starting with the easy question, Adam.
We aren't going to shy away from it. We don't answer it. Who's going to?
Yeah. Look, no, it does look like there's not a sort of the same thoughts across the world. But having said that, ATAGI has said all 12 to 15-year-olds can get the vaccine. And within that, they've sort of listed some priority groups, like I mentioned, and those are the children with the medical risk conditions. And the UK has a similar recommendation, so they also prioritise those groups. In fact, they broaden their priority groups a little bit as well. The other thing to say is that there are other countries that are also giving 12 to 17-year-olds, and that includes the US, Germany, France, Japan, Israel, Ireland, Mexico, Indonesia, Singapore, so in Canada. So there are lots of other countries that are giving it routinely to that age group. There's going to be, I think, when you read sort of between the lines of the JCVI, which is the UK equivalent of ATAGI, they've now, it sounds like the politicians have asked the chief health officers to consider the broader aspects of vaccinating the youth, and that includes things like the ability for the kids potentially to not spread it as much and therefore get back into school programs, and that we know the benefit that has on their sort of health, mental health and well-being, etc. So my guess is that JCVI might start to move towards, as Otago has done and as many other countries have done, in the next probable month, would be my guess. They're in a slightly different situation to us in that they've had much more disease than we've had. So a fair proportion of their under 20-year-olds have already been naturally infected anyway, which is slightly different to Australia, where we haven't had, although the Delta variant, there's a rise in the younger adolescents being infected, it's nowhere near as much burden of disease as there has been in the UK. So for them, the UK decided, on balance, there was a slightly better benefit for vaccinating against the negative side effects. When you read the JCVI statement, they're talking about waiting just to see a little bit more data about the myocarditis story. But there's lots of articles, an article in the BMJ sort of saying, well, perhaps that's not the way to go, and perhaps that, if we want to get kids back into school environment, we should get them vaccinated. So there's a little bit of debate in the UK anyway about the JCVI statement. So so I'm just sort of throwing out concepts there. But Australia is a slightly different position to the UK in that we've nowhere near had as much disease in our under 20 population. And so essentially we have a naive, non-exposed population for whom that 12 to 17 age group, the benefits for preventing them from getting COVID are probably slightly higher.
Okay, and I've just want to clarify the rate that the vaccines generally reduce contracting COVID. I've read different estimates of around 20 to 30%. Is that about right? Is that what, in terms of transmissibility?
Yeah, so in terms of if you are vaccinated, you've got, what we do know is if you're vaccinated, you can still get infected with the virus, but you carry the virus at a lower viral load, so you carry less of the virus, and you also carry the virus for a shorter period. So based on those 2 points, less of the virus and carrying it for less number of days, you're less likely to transmit it onto others than if you were, say, unvaccinated, when you have more virus and you carry it for longer. So that's a key point, and that's why vaccinating is not 100% protection, that's for sure. And so this is where these discussions come into, perhaps over time you might get more what we call infection in the vaccinated people, and you might then get them to spread it on to the unvaccinated. So I think to walk away from this, people need to hear that if you are vaccinated, you can still, when you get exposed to the virus, you shouldn't get sick, end up in hospital, but you can still have the virus, you just have less of it and you carry it for shorter time period, and therefore you're less likely to transmit it on.
Okay. Thanks, Nick. Now I'm going to go to the questions now, and there's a lot of different questions, and we might go in themes. I might just take questions first that are about the trials you talked about, and then we'll go to the other questions that are more distal. The first one is, what percentage of children had inflamed heart lining issues in the trial around? And I guess related to that, is there any evidence that side effect persists and causes long-term issues?
So there was only very, very few. In fact, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think I was reading it earlier today. Only a couple of kids in the trials that had some inflammation, but inflammation of the heart lining happens all the time. This is not kids trial. This was in the adult trials. Inflammation of the heart lining can happen intermittently from a range of causes, the most common of which is a virus. So there was no signal in the trial that this was a definite risk, and it was only when it got out into the community that it was picked up. And so we sort of expect that if it's sort of an estimate of 1 in 20, 1 in 30,000, if you've got a trial of 30,000 people, you might sort of see one or so people on the trial who has it. And that's why we do this ongoing surveillance when the vaccine gets into the community, because we know that these sorts of rarer side effects we won't be able to pick up in the trial environment. And that's why it's really important that they get surveillance once they get into the community. And that's exactly what's been happening. And that's how we found the clotting issue with the AstraZeneca. And that's how we're now finding the myocarditis and the pericarditis with these mRNA vaccines.
I did some work on that during the week, and based on the reported data, it was 0.00, I think 0.0004% of children that had the heart inflammation effects were concerning in the reported data. Now, there's a lot of questions around children, and a lot of people concerned about their child and when would they be likely to be vaccinated, and whether they should be extra concerned if they've got complex backgrounds, immune issues and things like that in children.
Yeah, so I think the first thing is don't be, overly concerned and anxious. We know overall, I think Phil might have mentioned it last time, that the children that get infected with COVID, for the most part, don't get nasty, don't get nasty disease, and that's really good. But in that subpopulation of kids that have these chronic medical conditions, yes, they should be trying to get a vaccine. Get one dose in, and that gives you some protection. 2 doses is better, but even 1 dose will give you some protection. So they're the ones that we really want to try and get the first doses into. And we all know there's been supply issues, but hopefully the supply issues will be less of a problem moving forward in the next few months. And then for the other kids, I can see there are questions which we might get to about the schools and what that means for, do you have to be vaccinated to go back to school? And that's not really, as far as I know, a definite decision from the health departments yet. But yeah, the focus initially, I think, should be on those kids that have a little bit higher chance of getting nasty, sick with COVID, and they're the ones we want to get the vaccines into first.
And around that, when is your best guess on when 7 to 12-year-olds are likely to be vaxxed? And are there any problems that we should be looking out for that population?
Yeah, so I don't think there's anywhere apart from perhaps one inactivated vaccine from China that's being used in the under 12. So there are trials underway, as you mentioned, and they're starting the 6 to 12-year-olds, and then they go down to 2 to 6-year-olds. And what they're particularly doing there is they're changing the dose. In fact, they're giving them less of the dose. So the traditional Pfizer is a 30 microgram dose. And in these trials, they're looking at the children and their response to a 10 or a 20 microgram dose. So they're actually giving them a lower amount because we think that the immune system is sort of a bit more robust and maybe not need as much to get a good response. So before we get that data, we're really not going to be moving in the under 12s because it might be that we can just use much less of the vaccine and still get a good immune response and good safety. So the trials are underway. They're in the order of 6 or 7 or so thousand kids. So far, I suspect that we're not really going to be using them in under 12s until at least next year in Australia.
Yeah, okay. There's a question about the trial period and the quality of the evidence. Is it usual practice to approve a vaccine without long-term studies, 2 years, or whatever the sort is that we haven't had?
Yeah, there is certainly usual to approve without 2 years of follow-up, yes. The HPV, the cervical cancer vaccine, was approved based on large trials again, 30,000 people in those trials. Followed up for 6 or 12 months. I think we have to remember that, we didn't, in order to protect people and save lives, the attitude was taken by the regulators that we've now got, 30,000 people showing that this vaccine is safe and it's effective and it will stop people dying, but admittedly only out to 3 or 4 months. So holding back that particular, thing that we could use to save lives was weighing on the regulators, and that's why they used those emergency use authorizations to get them out there. And as you've seen, we know that they work very well. They do stop people from dying and going to hospital. So I think we could have waited for, followed these people out for 12 months to 2 years, but that would have been at the expense of not rolling out the vaccines and protecting people.
Okay. We have a question about her young daughter's fertility and being impacted by vaccination.
Yeah, so again, this was looked at. It has been looked at in the older, the sort of younger women, the 20-year-olds. It will be being looked at in the 12 to 15s, but we don't have, like I mentioned before, we don't have data out 2, 3, 4 years yet. So we can't be absolutely definitive about that. But what we do know is that, COVID in a 20-year-old woman, it can be very nasty. So it's a bit of that same sort of story again. We don't want to stop the vaccines being used when they can potentially save lives. But having said that, there have been done studies in males where they've looked at sounds a bit weird to be doing this, but they've actually looked at taken sperm samples from males before vaccination and looked at the motility, and then taken samples after vaccination and shown that there's been no change in the motility of the sperm, how the sperm works and moves, and the sperm count, etc. So they've been certainly looking at males. I know some women have been reporting irregular changes in their periods. So sort of occasionally their periods is either have a longer period or a shorter period or breakthrough periods. And so that's being looked at by WHO as well as the TGA regulators, FDA, etc. But there's no definite evidence that it impacts fertility. Okay. That's a bit of a long-winded answer, but that's some of these sorts of things are definitely being looked at.
I mean, just to be clear, that's our role here, is to give you the real answers, even if they are complicated. Yeah. Novavax, when will it be available, and why isn't this the preferred vaccine for youth?
Yeah, so Novavax is a different sort of vaccine to the genetic one. So it's just a sort of a straightforward protein vaccine, old school sort of way to make it. It has gone through the phase 3 trials. As far as I understand, it's not been approved by any of the regulators anywhere. And I think that is something to do with the factory and whether look, to be honest, Novavax hasn't really got a vaccine to market before, unlike Pfizer and AstraZeneca, which have brought products from development to the community. Novavax is a bit new at that. And so I think they're just making sure that they've got the factory production all sorted up, all that sort of thing. So I don't know exactly why it hasn't been approved by the regulators, but it could be something to do with them getting their dossier ready, all the complete files that they need for the regulator to look at.
Okay, we've got a question about how regulatory bodies weigh up risk of disease and risk of vaccination. And is it likely that the TGA will determine that children under 12 have good outcomes even if they do contract COVID, and therefore deem it not worth the risk to vaccinate them?
Yeah, they could. So the TGA could look at the burden of disease and the severity of disease in the under 12s in Australia and say, look, in the main, the kids don't get too sick. Not many go to ICU and they recover very quickly, and therefore rolling out a community program to all under 12s, the cost of that, the potential side effects, it may not be really meet cost effectiveness. So before this, in the old days pre-COVID, when a vaccine was put onto the national program, it underwent a very thorough cost-benefit analysis with the PBAC, and they looked at the whole benefit of the vaccine versus the costs and side effects. And based on that, if it was deemed to be cost-effective, then the government could put it onto the national program. And so I think that sort of process has probably been changed a bit because we are in a pandemic, but certainly the regulator would be looking at the safety and efficacy. And what the regulator tends to do is it looks at the trials data. So it looks at all the work done in the animals, the work from the trials, and then it decides based on that whether this vaccine is safe and effective. But it's then up to the government to decide whether or not to put it into the program, if that makes sense. And for the government to put it into the program, that does rely on things like the burden of disease estimates and how severe and sick the kids get, and whether the vaccine can, prevent those and overall be of a better positive benefit. So that's the government's role then.
Yeah. Okay. What are some of the contraindications for the COVID vaccine administration in youth? And is there any preliminary data on mRNA vaccines? Oh, we've already answered that one for under 12s. Maybe just answer the first bit.
So the contraindications really depends on, well, at the moment, the only vaccine in the under 18s is the Pfizer, and it's as we know, an mRNA vaccine. So the main contraindication is an allergy to PEG, which is sort of polyethylene glycol, which is the anaphylaxis to that. Is there a contraindication? The other one is there's some sort of precaution. So if you have had recent pericarditis or myocarditis within the last few months, you need to talk to the cardiologist about that. And then there are a range of other sort of cardiac related things, like, having a history of complex congenital heart disease or those sorts of things that you also want to talk to the heart doctor about. Okay. So they're the main ones.
All right. I'm just in awe of your knowledge, Nick, and we're just about there. Should Nurofen be given as a precaution to an inflamed heart side effect, regardless of symptoms? And if so, at what dose?
So I think the first thing to say is if you do have chest pain after this vaccine, go and get it checked out by the GP or the ED, because there are lots of causes of chest pain. And so they would normally do an ECG, the heart tracing, and they might take some bloods to look for some markers. If that's all clear, they might say, well, this could be muscular chest pain, and then you can use some Nurofen. In terms of the dose, I would just follow the instructions on the bottle. That's always the safest. You can buy Nurofen over the market, so just use the right dose for your age. And then so that's the most important thing. You get it checked out because we want to make sure that we're not missing the heart muscle inflammation one, because that's just a little bit more severe than just the lining of the heart, and then the other ones could be just muscular, if that makes sense.
Okay. If there's anything you take away from this presentation, read the label on the bottle.
Yeah.
That's right. Is asthma proving to be a risk factor for children under 12?
So asthma is, but the regulators or the TGA equivalent, so the ATAGI equivalent, have defined it as the more severe end in the asthma. So not the person that uses the Ventolin puffer once every sort of 3 or 4 months. This is the people that are on, inhaled steroids every day and have had previous times where they've had to go to ICU, etc. So they're the more severe end of the asthma spectrum.
I should just say, actually, I'm trying to find it. Here it is here. There was a trial published in adolescents with, this is not it, with immune compromised conditions. And that study showed a similar safety profile. I can't find it right now, but yeah, okay. All right, I think we've actually, I'm so impressed. We've got one last question, and then I think it's time out. The last question is, we've answered can I just say we've answered every single question that was listed. So thank you so much, Nick. Great and informative presentation, guys. Thank you very much, Brian. Will children under 12 have to complete a health check before any immunisation to rule out any issues beforehand?
Yeah, so every person, no matter what age they are, goes through a pre-vaccination checklist. And so the vaccinator, the nurse or the GP or whoever's doing it, has to tick off a range of things. And particularly for the COVID vaccines, the checklists do ask about heart issues and allergies and that sort of thing. So yes, they should go through that checklist before you get the vaccine. And if you're at all worried, then, talk to your GP beforehand as well.
Okay. Now, the last one actually just came through then. Someone must have want to get a quick one in. And this is a topic that we're going to deal with in the future, but this is a really tricky one, and I'm not sure we can answer it well enough right now. But maybe, Nick, you have some advice you have for family members who are vaccine skeptics. I recall research on this topic pre-COVID that suggested telling real people's stories rather than statistics were more impactful than changing views. What is the latest perspective on this? I mean, we are going to discuss this in a future webinar, but Nick, what do you have any advice?
Yeah, so the person you want to get on for this is Julie Leask, who's also a Sydney Uni person. And there's a nice website which is called Talking About Immunisation. And it's all one word. And have a look at that one, because it goes through the sorts of pictorial illustrations. But yeah, and I think I mean, we see people in our vaccine clinics who are vaccine skeptics, and they've often come, by the time they've got to the clinic, they sort of have done a lot of research. And so we tend to go through each of their questions one by one. But I think trying to find out what it exactly is it that they're worried about, and narrowing it down to that. Some people have things that are just sort of completely, unusual, let's say, or don't make sense, and they're often a bit easier to sort of say, well, have you thought about X or Y instead? So trying to just see it from their point of view. I think trying to point out that and also I think the easier ones to fight are the conspiracy theories. There's no conspiracy here. This is not us being paid by Big Pharma to make money for Big Pharma. This is all about vaccinating people to stop them from getting serious and sick from nasty viruses, bacteria, etc. So I think trying to understand exactly what they're worried about, pointing them to there's lots and lots of websites. We mentioned a couple before, NCS, MVEC. There's a really nice one in the US by the Children's Hospital at Philadelphia. That has a really great vaccine education centre there. And just seeing exactly what their main issue is, and that might, even them talking about it might just, and you not sort of, Julie Leask talks about not automatically blocking it and pushing back their argument. You sort of take it on board, listen to it, and then try and redirect it, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Nick. That's really helpful. I know in my own experiences, I've gotten really frustrated, and my dear wife has gone, calm down, Adam, just relax and investigate and don't criticise. And I think, the idea, what you're suggesting is something I struggle to do. And, it's not really about vaccines because, this is a complex picture, but it is about people using the right information to guide their decisions. And when people present stuff that's a bit left of field, that's wrong, it's really about trying to reflect and try and understand and try and help. I guess that's the key. All right, thanks everyone. We've done it. And next, this coming Monday, we'll be having Associate Professor Fiona Comfor talk about her just wonderful research in helping grandparents connect with kids from afar. And we'll be doing something more than just logging onto Zoom and Facebook, and giving practical strategies for families to keep connected. And then on the following Monday, in our health and medical research stream, we'll be talking about mental health and COVID, and we'll be talking about the rates of mental health increase, particularly in Sydney, with Dr. Catherine Knight. All right, thank you very much, and keep well, and keep on our website, and send us any questions you have on kidsinmind@sydney.edu.au. Thank you very much.